Warning, warning, citizens of Kenosha County. Warning, warning, citizens of Kenosha County. You are approaching the red zone. KRED is on the air. Welcome to KRED. In this episode of KRED, we are going to listen to snippets of an interview I did with Anthony LOCOCO, running for appeals court judge here in southeast Wisconsin. So let's take a listen to Anthony LOCOCO.
I am running for Court of Appeals judge in Wisconsin, but as you sort of alluded to in your intro, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ first. My faith comes first for me. I'm a family man, live in Wisconsin in Waukesha County with my wife Angela and my 4 young children, which certainly plays into the importance of something that you talk about quite a bit, which is keeping our communities safe through our legal system. I won't give you the full rundown of my career, but I'm a lawyer, spent a lot of time litigating in defense of our constitutional rights, whether that's free speech, religious liberty, ensuring that we have secure elections, you name it, Second Amendment, hunting rights. And as I, worked my way through some of these cases, you come across some very good judges, you come across some so-so judges, and unfortunately, you do come across some judges that maybe aren't doing their job as well as they should be. I'm sure the same is true for our law enforcement officers. And so I did feel a strong calling from God to make this run for the Court of Appeals, which, as we'll talk about, is one of the 3 levels of the judiciary here in Wisconsin.
Found to be interesting about Anthony is the way he views a appeals court judge. He says some pretty profound he has some pretty profound thoughts on it. So let's take a listen as to what he believes is really the role of a appeals court judge.
Decisions you're going to be making could have happened years ago. You could be deciding on a case that you're strictly reading in the paper, and I would imagine that's a challenge to view a piece of paper, to know that things have been in the past, and now suddenly you're almost armchair quarterbacking, aren't you? From a certain perspective about what you're about to rule on, that can't be easy.
Absolutely. I think, and this gets to the idea of why humility is so important for our judges, because as you say, the appellate process, the whole litigation process takes years and years. And this might be a good point to mention what it is exactly that an appellate court, which is the court that I'm running for, does, as opposed to a trial court.
Yep.
A trial court is going to deal with sort of the front line questions of, let's say in a criminal case, is this person guilty or not guilty? Okay, and so the judge, when he sentences that individual, is judging that person. Then it may go up and get appealed to a higher level, to an appeals court. And in that situation, the judge is looking at whether the trial court judge did his or her job. So I wouldn't necessarily put it in the terms of a judge judging a judge, but the judge is looking at everything that occurred in the trial court and making sure that it happened according to law. Okay, as you point out, this is going to take years to get there. And the appellate court judge, unlike the trial court judge, is sitting in a room, does not get to hear from the defendant, does not get to hear from the officers, does not get to judge credibility based on live testimony, does not get to hear, see the conduct of the attorneys on each side. It's a cold paper record. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be done. You just have to be aware of the limitations and the shortcomings. And that's why a good appellate judge has to be ready in appropriate moments to defer to the trial court judge and say, you know what? The trial court judge was in the best position to decide this. And I'm not going to, at the last second, out of some, let's say, desire to advance a personal political agenda or something else, throw everything off the rails. So lots of times, a Court of Appeals judge's job is to get out of the way.
Interesting. Yeah, and I've never quite heard it put that way, but that makes a ton of sense.
I had Anthony tell me his experience as a judge, and as you can see, or as you'll hear, um, he's had some pretty good experience. So let's take a listen to his experience with the Supreme Court.
You're talking about U.S. or Wisconsin Supreme Court?
Wisconsin.
Yes, I've been in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court many times for various cases. I've argued in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court as well, and because of the nature of my practice, which involved a lot of constitutional law and personal liberties, those tend to be the high-profile cases that can often attract the attention of our Wisconsin Supreme Court. So, just to give some examples, during the COVID pandemic, that was kind of a stress test for our system. There were churches being closed, schools being closed, businesses being closed, and a lot of constitutional rights at stake. And so we were frequently in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court in order to, figure out those issues.
Has any of your before you got to that point, was any of your cases obviously looked at by the appellate, or did you go skip the appellate and go right to the Supreme?
Yeah, both. So there's a couple of different processes in Wisconsin, and it's true in a lot of different states as well. The normal course is to go through the Court of Appeals, and certainly I have litigation experience in front of the Court of Appeals. But there will be some unusual cases that you can go straight to the Supreme Court, either from the trial court, or frankly, you can go straight to the Supreme Court without even starting in the trial court. Those are going to be very rare cases that involve questions of extreme public importance and maybe time-sensitive questions. You can think about like elections, or again, COVID is a good example where sometimes you just can't wait the 3 or 4 years that it might take to get up to the Supreme Court.
Now, I asked Anthony about his thoughts on separation of church and state. And take a listen to what he had to say about that.
So yeah, I think it's a common misconception, this idea of the separation between church and state. As you point out, that's not language that appears in the Constitution. It's, famously from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. Instead, we have this Establishment Clause, which had a very specific idea at the founding, which was this notion that we weren't going to have a national religion. But it's important to point out that there were actually state establishments of religion at the time. So different states that had different established religions. So certainly the founders were not getting, or framers were not getting to the notion that, we weren't going to have religion in public life. I mean, you could look at specifically some of our most revered framers, like John Adams, talked about how this Constitution was made for a religious people. And George Washington, the same. Because why? Why was it made for a religious people? Well, because we decided that we were going to limit the authority of the federal government through the separation of powers, which meant that we, the people, had to govern ourselves.
Right.
We had to be virtuous. We had to have reference to our duties to God and to each other. And without that basis, in a moral code, our country was going to devour itself, because the government was not going to come in every case and restore order. And so I think that points to a little bit of what you're seeing today, because we're losing all these shared values. But at the same time, I think there's reason for optimism, because you're seeing in the comments of some leaders, J.D. Vance comes to mind and some others, this return to the notion of, no, we're not going to ignore the divine. We're not going to, ghettoize religious believers, and they have a place not only in this country, but also if they choose to get into public life, they don't have to pretend to be something that they're not. And it's one of the reasons why, in my very small way, I love doing interviews like this one, where we could talk about the role of religion in the context of the judiciary.
I asked Anthony about activist judges, and he's going to explain what he believes and how he looks at activist judges. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what do we want our judges to do? I know this gets a little bit to the basics, but I saw a poll the other day that said something like 50% of American adults couldn't name the three branches of government. So I think a little refresher is not necessarily a bad thing, right? We have our legislature that passes the law. They are the policy makers. They decide the policy, whether it be Congress or the legislature in Wisconsin. Then you have our executive branch that enforces the law through various means, including law enforcement. And then cases that get brought in court, the question gets presented, well, what does the law mean? There might be questions where it's unclear how the law applies. And the role of a judge is to impartially, without respect to persons, without respect to the judge's own personal beliefs, say what the law is and not what the law should be. Okay, without fear, without favor, just to neutrally apply the law. And the Federalist Papers that were written, very famously said that the judiciary was the weakest branch, that they didn't have the power of the purse, the judiciary didn't have an army, but they only had their judgment. They only had their paper decisions that said what the law is. Well, we've seen that. It's almost quaint now to think about the judiciary being the least dangerous branch, because we've seen that inverted. We see litigants trying to use the courts to advance their policy preferences because maybe they don't have the votes in Congress, or they don't have the votes in the legislature. And so it's an abuse of the system. And what's worse is when you have judges who are willing to go along with this plan. And that's where you get into this notion of an activist judge who is not deciding based on the law, but is deciding on something else, maybe their own personal belief about what is fair, or their own personal belief about what the Congress and the legislature should have done. And it really creates a problem for the system because, there are only so many controls on our judges. And so it's absolutely essential that we put judges at every level, state and federal, who have the humility to recognize that, their job is rather limited, and that the big questions of the day are not to be decided by 9 lawyers in robes, but to be decided by the people's representatives, because it is those people, those representatives, that are ultimately quickly accountable to the people.
Yeah, and I'll tell you.
So I asked Anthony about one of the roles that a appellate court judge has is to actually make a ruling on what juries had to say. And this is what he had to say about dealing with possibly overruling juries.
There are people who love the jury system. There are people who hate the jury system. I think it's genius. And I'm not really so much of a trial attorney. As I said, I'm an appellate attorney, but I've talked to trial attorneys who say, you know what, the jury system works. And you can understand why that is. It's because we recognize that judges are humans too. It's one of the reasons why we have an appeal. It's because we realize that the judges are not infallible. We respect them, but they can make mistakes like anyone else. And so this notion that we're going to let a jury of your peers decide some of these fact questions, render a decision on some questions, it's one of these many release valves, the way that power is further diffused, and it's a safety valve against unjust rulings. Now, when it gets to the appellate judge, and it is a good question, but unfortunately my answer is not going to be very good, because it goes back to something I've been saying, which is this notion that the appellate judge's job is not to substitute him or herself for the jury, except in extremely rare cases. Now, we have the appellate judge there as an additional protection. If the jury went way outside what they were supposed to do, their decision wasn't based on the record or what have you, there can be limited circumstances where, yes, that appellate judge has to step in and reverse. But the judge has to do so, only after very careful analysis, very careful thought, in a position of humility, because they have to realize that they are, as you say, they're overruling the decisions of a number of people who were there in person listening to the evidence. So, whether or not it's a good idea, it's going to depend on the facts of an individual case. And I'm sure you and your listeners can think of examples where, boy, we're glad that we have an appellate judge there just in case. And there are lots of cases where,
Yeah.
we want that appellate judge to get out of the way. And sometimes that's what the judge has to do.
Yeah.
So Anthony's going to give us a rundown of what exactly he's running for and where he's running for. So let's take a listen to what Anthony has to say about the run itself.
So I'm running for District 2 of the Court of Appeals. Again, we have a 3-level judiciary. We have the trial courts at the bottom, the state Supreme Court at the top, and in the middle is our Court of Appeals. It's 16 judges. Court of Appeals is the one I'm running for. It's 16 judges divided among 4 districts. Okay, so District 2 is 12 county area out of our 72 counties here in Wisconsin. And it's essentially, it's a ring around Milwaukee. It doesn't include Milwaukee, but it includes a lot of those suburban counties like Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington, all the way down to Racine, Kenosha, and all the way up to Manitowoc in that area. So it's a pretty large area. It's almost like a congressional seat. And as you pointed out, it's quite a race to jump into when you don't have that political background, but we're doing okay.
Cool. How many counties have you been to?
I've been to them all.
Have you really?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the district. I haven't been to all 72. I've been to all 12.
Good for you. That's awesome.
Anthony gives credit to his family for this run. He's got a young family.
Well, that's where the saint in my life comes in. My wife Angela. She's the one at home every night with the 4 little ones. Their ages are 3, 5, 7, and 9, so they're all pretty young.
Wow.
And so she's a stay-at-home mom, and she and all my kids are making sacrifices so that I can be out campaigning. The nice thing is I'm in private practice. I run my own appellate litigation firm. And so certainly that comes with its own stresses, running your own business and being a small business owner, but it also provides the flexibility that is useful in a campaign season. It allows me to kind of do some work at odd hours and campaign during the day, that kind of thing.
So near the end, I asked Anthony to just give me a little bit of rundown of his background. He'll explain to you that he had done some work with Will and Wisconsin Law and Liberty. So let's listen to what Anthony has to say about his previous work.
Yes, I was an attorney for many years at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, or WIL. And yeah, it's a public interest group. We take our cases, where we took them, they're still operating on all cylinders, pro bono, meaning they don't charge. They provide free legal services. And because they're litigating in defense of constitutional rights, oftentimes people whose rights are being violated, they don't necessarily have the money for all the litigation that's needed to go from, the circuit court to the Court of Appeals to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, sometimes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so they'll do it for free. And so I'd say that's where I kind of cut my teeth on appellate litigation, as we discussed. The nature of those cases meant that we were in some of these higher courts a lot. And that's where I started to first hear, God's call to focus on appellate litigation.
Here's kind of Anthony's last minute plug as to why the voters should vote for him. Let's take a listen.
Absolutely. Well, I think if you're living in Wisconsin, but frankly, if you're living anywhere, in the country right now, you can probably see, as we've been talking about, that we are badly in need not only of principled judges, judges who are going to rule according to the law and not their personal political preferences, but also we need courageous judges, judges who are going to fight hard for our families, fight hard for our businesses, and fight hard for our constitutional rights, and do so without being afraid of reactions. And if you look at my record as an attorney at will, fighting on free speech, religious liberty, election integrity, parents' rights, I think it's very clear that that's the kind of judge that I'll be. And I'm very humbled to have the support in this race of many other proven judicial conservatives like Wisconsin Supreme Court Justices Rebecca Bradley and Annette Ziegler, former Governor Scott Walker, many of the sheriffs, Milwaukee Police Association, Waukesha County Police Chiefs Association, and many other groups. So I won't bore you with all the other names, but I've had enormous support in this race. And I think it's because there's so much recognition that our judiciary needs help right now, unfortunately. And so that's what I'm pledging to do. I'm going to take that same fight that I've shown to the bench. I'm going to do it impartially, absolutely, but I'm going to do it with courage.
So I also asked Anthony how we could help him. And what I did not realize that he says in this interview is that he as a judge can't ask for money, which that makes a ton of sense. So I asked him how we could help him in his campaign. And this is what he had to say.
Thanks for asking. So as a judicial candidate in Wisconsin, ethics rules prohibit me from asking for money, but you can find out all kinds of ways to support me on my website, lococoforjudge.com, LOCOCO for judge.com, and you can learn more about my background and even see a picture of my wonderful children.
Again, this is snippets of a hour-long interview that I did with Anthony on my other podcast, Ministry of the Bad Judger. If you're interested in that, you can go take a listen to that podcast. And we get into more of a religious aspect, I guess you could say, because it's on my other podcast. That's what I talk about mostly. So if you want to, you can go take a listen to that. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by KRED.
Attention, citizens. Attention, citizens. You are now leaving the red zone. You are now leaving the red zone. You've been listening to a broadcast of KRED.